In this sense, the literature I draw is concerned with understanding what such events expose about the human vulnerabilities, as well as what those vulnerabilities might contribute to the understanding of disaster itself. It is this latter point that I use as a jumping off, element here that I use as a jumping off point in this paper. I do this through a re-examination of an event called Dzud, a happening specific to Mongolia and Inner Asia that leads to massive livestock death. Much of my previous research has focused on the various dynamics that contributed to one of these events, including the impact of bribery and corruption on household mobility, the effect of community-based natural resource management programs, and shifts in property on differential patterns of vulnerability, household vulnerability. In other words, I have explored what such events expose. Now I return to the event itself to ask, what is it? I do this because I'm frustrated by the appropriation and reification of Dzud as a thing itself, as an objective hazard at the expense of other, potentially more helpful meanings. This is exemplified by contemporary endeavors to locate Dzud as an object of analysis, as a bounded thing of nature, amenable to scientific precision by economists, ecologists, meteorologists, climatologists, and range scientists, and most particularly in applied interventions. In contrast, I explore the possibilities that notions of hybridity and agency, Blazer's use of political ontology, and also Mongolian Buddhist and animist cosmologies might offer towards a reformulation of Dzud as a historically contingent process that must first be understood through those facing Dzud. By reframing Dzud in such a way, I argue, we arrive at new and interestingly more practical understandings of vulnerability, including a perspective that more closely attends to the deep spiritual implications of facing Dzud. Moreover, I argue that in larger time and space frameworks, Dzud is not a departure from the normal functioning of society, but rather a conditional aspect of socio-political life on the steppe. In the early months of 2010, Mongolia experienced the worst winter disaster in over 100 years. 60% of the total landmass of Mongolia was covered with 20 to 40 centimeters of snow, and temperatures dipped below negative 40 degrees Celsius, and in some regions below negative 50 degrees Celsius, occurring over a 10-day period. By the end of the spring, the official estimate totaled over 9 million animals died. In all, 21% of the national herd was wiped out in a matter of months, affecting nearly 500,000 people in rural regions. That's a pretty large percentage of the total population of Mongolia. 33,000 families lost half or more of their herds, and 9,000 families lost everything. In the winters of 1999 to 2002, Dzud struck various regions of the country. 30% of the national herd was destroyed, and economic damages resulted in almost 400 million US in losses, which in turn precipitated a 4% drop in national GDP. The UNDP reported increased rates of malnutrition, maternal mortality, depression, and suicide. They estimated that roughly 50,000 migrants fled rural regions for urban ones. The picture I have just described is what most Western analysts mean when they discuss Dzud. Yet in most years, smaller, less widespread, and lower magnitude Dzud occur in specific locales across the country. In fact, during my period of 15 months living with mobile livestock herders in 2007, 2008, I experienced the profound effect that Dzud can have on a household. My hosts lost 30% of their herd of livestock, enough of a shock that they made a partial exit from the herding economy, and more recently found out that they're no longer herding. And these are pictures from that winter. My concern with Dzud begins from this disjuncture between what I witnessed and experienced in these other frames. In particular, I'm primarily interested with the deployment of Dzud as a knowledge claim, exemplified by the effect of these descriptions. In popular media from the New York Times, CNN, the BBC, Dzud is described as everything from a winter storm to a freeze to a blizzard. The same is largely true in the academic and development literature, where economists attempt to track Dzud primarily through thresholds of livestock loss, and natural scientists debate the various assortment of climatological, meteorological, and ecological data in order to more effectively predict its occurrence. This is particularly evident in development interventions aimed at mitigating or recovering from Dzud events such as livestock insurance and restocking. These programs are founded on the notion that Dzud is a discrete hazard that privileges the priority of an objective in non-human nature. This also makes it more amenable to a risk analysis, and in turn organizes practices around a set of potential interventions. Yet these categorizations and attempts at precisions, I argue, fail. Dzud is too unruly a phenomenon. Herders in Mongolia do face a variety of risks that pose threats, including predation by wolves and birds of prey, disease, lightning strikes, flash floods, and numerous others. On a grander scale, households also confront drought or gam. Yet the phenomenon referred to as Dzud is different and is the most consequential. In Agumar, where I did my research, and elsewhere in Mongolia, herders describe Dzud in a number of ways. For instance, white Dzud, which is where snow covers the pasture. Black Dzud, where there is no snow. Iron Dzud, which is where there's ice covers the pasture. Cold Dzud, where the temperature simply dropped low enough that animals die from the temperature. Hoof Dzud, where large herds of animals degrade pasture by running over it, leading to pasture degradation during the winter. And combined Dzud, where many of these elements can come together. None of these, however, are essential types. There are ways to describe Dzud, and there are more ways of describing Dzud than I list here. Moreover, Dzud is difficult to define within the conceptual toolkit often used in disasters. For instance, Dzud at different scales can be both acute and chronic. It can be both covariate and idiosyncratic. It can be both major and minor. Nevertheless, we do see at least a few common characteristics. Dzud occur in winter, and they are events in which livestock die in large percentages. But this still doesn't tell us much, and so the question of what Dzud are remains. As a beginning to an answer, I suggest that Dzud is firstly an experience, not a hazard or shock attributed to any one weather-based variable or non-human environmental event in itself. For example, despite the conditions in Agumar, where I did my fieldwork, some households experienced Dzud in 2008 while others did not. First of all, moving away from a region that exhibits the possibility for severe consequences means that the household will not face Dzud. That's a particular phrase in Mongolian, to face Dzud. In fact, as they said, Dzud for them does not exist. When I asked these households if a Dzud happened in the district and county where I was conducting research that they had left, herders were puzzled with the geographical question I was asking, and explained that, well, some people faced it and other people didn't. In other words, Dzud does not exist on its own as a hazard. It must have a social referent. The linkage is that a Dzud cannot exist outside of loss because it is, in some ways, it is the loss, or the experience of loss, and one that extends beyond livestock. In this sense, Dzud is only hybrid. It can't be broken down or dissected into natural or social. Rather, its very nature is always simultaneously human and non-human. This does not minimize the materiality of Dzud, nor the range of actants involved in its precipitation, or its deep institutionalization, as I will discuss. Yet it should be clear Dzud has been misunderstood, and situating this phenomenon within an ontology that posits nature as something out there, a discrete realm of being in contrast to the human, will not suffice. Dzud implied different natures. And here I draw on Mario Blazer's work on the political ontology of conservation engagements. In this work, rather than attend to the truth of a knowledge claim, Blazer explores how different ontological natures, assumptions about being itself, result in fundamentally different ways of being in relation. The Mongol word for disaster is gamshik. But when I asked herders if Dzud was gamshik, the reply was universally no. In May of 2008, during my fieldwork, a calamitous spring storm swept through the region to the north. That only lasted a few hours, 200,000 head of livestock perished. Wind turned to driving rain, which turned to sleet, then to a foot of snow as temperatures dropped from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to zero within just a couple hours. Animals literally froze where they lay, which is what's happening today. This is the day after. For herders I spoke with, this was a gamshik. This was disaster. Given the similarity to the hazards associated with Dzud, the freezing, the snow, I asked why this was not a Dzud. The answer that they gave was that this was sudden. It was a surprise. Ginitbossen is what they told me. It's sudden. Dzud, however, is not a surprise in the same way. In other words, it's not non-routine or disordering. Now, the distinction here is not between fast onset and slow onset disaster. It is the distinction between something truly non-routine and something more problematically chronic and entrenched. And in fact, looking over the longue durée, we see evidence of Dzud occurring with considerable frequency, at least for the last 1,000 years, as far as historical texts demonstrate. And interestingly, it never upsets the basic economic inequalities on which Mongolian hierarchies and political orders have been formed. Moreover, in both historical texts and in my fieldwork, I found that Dzud was also highly moralized. It was often described as ugly or dirty. There's a lot of different ways that people describe it, but these were frequent. This, I think, points to something else entirely and requires that we frame Dzud ontologically from a Mongolian cosmopolitical perspective. In Mongolian social landscapes, one place in the world reflects one's internal chat, which translates to like capacity or ability or power. This inherent attribute of an individual is the outcome of an interplay of spirits, one's lineage, and the distribution of favors and blessings from Tengu, or God. The landscape itself is full of lively spirits. Mountain worship rituals and oblations appease the various anthropomorphized beings, and God is called on for favor. Lack of favor or blessing can result in the diminishing of one's spirit, and this renders one exceedingly vulnerable to Dzud. In contrast, those who are in God's favor or endowed with these characteristics are unlikely to face Dzud. In interviews with wealthy herders, for instance, I asked what would they do if they lost all their animals in a Dzud. But several of them simply laughed, saying this would never happen. Accordingly, Dzud not only exposes this inequality, it also functions to reproduce it. Moreover, discourses of fate and destiny loom large in everyday understandings of the up and down of the world, and they are deeply rooted in the very state of being itself. Literally, vigos, a term that translates to both being and nature. It draws off the verb to be. It should be no surprise that Dzud is described in such terms as an element of being. Dzud in this sense is more like the annual spring birthing of lambs. In some ways it is expected. It is fundamental to the unfolding of herding life on the steppe. It should also be no surprise that it is also on this, that it is on this lattice work that Mongolian human ecologies emerge. Configurations of power, knowledge, and institutions have co-evolved with environmental actants to create Dzud. Dzud as a chronic condition of living on the steppe is, in short, the way the world works. It is fundamental to vigos, to nature. In this sense, it's not a surprise that its consequences are deep and profound. The loss of livestock negates the rationale for a pastoral livelihood. Consequently, because claims to land, the vital resource that animates both human and non-human, are severed, a herder's connection to the world itself is broken. Dzud then not only reflects one's position, it is fundamental to its production, and as such is fundamentally tied to the political order. Naturalized within Mongolian cosmologies, the disruption brought about by Dzud for individuals and for households facilitates larger political modalities that have long reigned on the steppe. In this vein, then, Dzud is not a failure of the human system. It is the functioning of the human system. This cosmopolitical interpretation of Dzud has some serious practical implications. Dzud as a force of Mongol nature implies, in a radical sense, the social and political roots of its existence, and also its apparent utility. As such, it also undermines the fundamental basis on which current interventions are formulated. In conclusion, and this is only a partial beginning of an answer, so it necessitates more research. In conclusion, I leave with a series of questions that should help prompt this. One, in considering that this is occurring in a particular context, how is the marketization and financialization of livestock production altering this cosmopolitical order and the nature of Dzud in new ways? Additionally, in this context, then, what becomes the utility of Dzud? Thank you.